So in the interest of time, I'm just going to do a quick introduction of myself. I'm Brad Hyde. I'm the Director of Tax and Estate Planning for Western Canada. I work with IDC advisors across the prairies. And today what we're talking about is the high net worth market. And I thought what I'd talk about is what's working in 2022. So what have I been seeing? What has worked well, and where are we getting some successes? And I'll talk about a couple of successes through cases that I've worked on this year, and we'll start from there. So really what we're talking about, as I said, a couple of hot buttons for high net worth clients and a couple of recent cases, and then just a quick overview of working the process of working with somebody from the tax and estate planning group. Okay. So the topics I'm going to talk about today are retirement, taxes, business succession and / continuation, estate freezes, trusts, and charitable donation strategies. So each of these are all hot buttons. They're things that I've been talking to clients about and things that clients have shown definite interest in having conversations about this year. So I'm just going to jump in and start here. So with retirement, really what we're talking about for the most part is, at the end of the day, I've built a business up, and now I have to think about, how do I use that business to fund my retirement? And one of the ways that I say that is, how do I monetize my retirement? So where does the cash come from? Have I saved up all my money inside my company, inside, say, maybe a holding company structure, or have I been pulling money out and putting it into other vehicles, my TFSAs, my non-registered accounts, maybe some RSPs? We don't see RSPs as much with business owners, but I have been seeing some business owners with some significant RSPs in the last few months here. So where does that all come from? And one of the first things that we need to do is do a fact find so that we understand all of that. And as we do that fact find, we start to drive out where those values are. So assuming that the money is in the corporation, which is inside a holding company structure likely, which is the most common way business owners retain their assets, what happens when we get to the retirement stage? Do they have enough money built up in that pool? And what's the value of the corporation that's above the holding company that's going to also contribute at that time? And oftentimes that's the bigger pool of money, is the sale of the shares or the ongoing retirement income that they're going to receive, depending on how they've succeeded their company. Okay, so that's what ties into that succession and continuation discussion. And one of the things that we get to is, when a key person, I've built my business up over years, and I'm that key person that's built that business. When I decide to retire, what actually happens to the business? And can I drive an income from the ongoing revenue of that business? Or am I having to make a sale of that business to monetize that asset, right? And so that's going to play into that retirement discussion as far as amounts of money. It's also going to play into discussion around, where does the income come from? Okay. The other question that I like to ask is, what does retirement actually look like? So when we talk to business owners, oftentimes they talk about retirement differently than employees that are working in a job that get to a certain age and then they retire with a pension. Okay, that's a very, very fixed structure. With business owners, oftentimes what we're talking about is, does retirement mean that you're going to continue to work at all? Does it mean that you might work part-time? Does it mean that you're going to continue to work full-time, but you're going to give up a lot of the majority of the day-to-day duties, but you're still going to be going in and helping the business continue to run and drive and things? So there's all these kinds of questions that we need to understand what that retirement looks like for that business owner. And it may be a 10-year period that they work. It may be a 20-year period that they're going to work. It may be something completely different. When we have a handle on that, we can plan around it. And that's really what it comes down to, is understanding what it is the client's ideal situation is, so that we can put a plan together that makes sense for them. Then we get into the risk profile of the assets as a retirement asset. So oftentimes when we see pools of assets during the growth phase or the accumulation phase, we see more equity exposure in those investments. And generally, when we get to a retirement mentality, we get to the distribution phase. And so if I'm in that distribution phase, is my risk profile the same as it was during the accumulation phase? And if it's not, what should we be looking at to make sure that we're going in the right direction as per the client's direction that they're concerned about? And what I find oftentimes with business owners is they get more conservative with their investments as they get towards retirement. And that can be anytime from 50, 55 plus. They start to get a little bit more conservative, but I certainly find that once they get into a retirement mentality and they're going to be pulling money from their business, whether it's pools of assets or whether it's assets that are driven from revenue from the business, they might get a little bit more conservative with the business. That's not always the same direction as the people that are succeeding the business want to take. And oftentimes that's their children. They want to be more aggressive. They want to do more growth and things. And the business owner that's relying on that business for retirement sees that as risk to his retirement income. So all of these things have to be looked at and discussed together. And that certainly creates a lot of good discussion. And good discussion always comes out with good planning, and good planning always comes out with sales, whether it be on the investment side or using insurance products in the retirement package. So that's where I start with the retirement side of things. I'm going to move on here to talk about taxes. And taxes are always an interesting question with clients. One of the questions that I like to ask people about taxes is, how do they feel about paying taxes? And I've had a couple years in my 35 years working in this industry where clients say, well, that's how the government operates. They need to have their tax base. They need to operate the country, and that's how they operate it. But it's more often not that they hate paying taxes. So they're trying to minimize taxes, and that's where we have opportunities to talk to people about their taxes. So one of the things that we look at, particularly with business owners, is the tax on the capital gain that is created as a result of the growth of their company. So when I start a company, my adjusted cost base is very low. And as I grow and make that business viable business and have lots of assets in there, I've created a capital gain against the shares, the difference between my fair market value and my capital or my adjusted cost base. And so one of the things that I've been talking to clients about when it comes to taxes and capital gains tax planning is the capital gains inclusion rate. Now, we don't know for sure if the capital gains inclusion rate is going to change, but there certainly is a lot of talk about it. And just as an example, I was working with a company recently, and we had frozen the shares at about $20 million. And in Alberta, the tax rates on that at the top rate are 48%. So we've got an estimated tax on disposition at about $4.8 million. And that was fine. And so we did some planning around the $4.8 million. But then the client brought up this question around the capital gains inclusion rate. And if we went to a 75% inclusion rate with nothing else changing, so we still have the $20 million freeze amount, we have the top tax rate at 48%. My tax rate on disposition of those shares is now $7.2 million. The client was the one in this situation that said, well, shouldn't we be planning for the 7.2 versus the 4.8, because I think that the rate's going to change, right? So it is an interesting discussion, and I've raised this now. I've used this conversation with business owners, and there is some business owners that are really starting to consider doing some additional planning for a 75% inclusion rate, or at least a higher inclusion rate on the capital gains tax. So a good conversation, and it opens up, at least again, it opens up the conversation, and it talks about the tax planning that needs to be done as it results from the capital gains. Another area of tax that we get into a lot of discussions around ties into the retirement conversation. And that's, how do I extract funds from my corporation for personal use? Because once I get to retirement stage, if I built up those assets inside my corporation, I eventually have to take those assets out of my corporation to use them in my retirement. So how am I doing that, and what are the tax implications of doing that? So we get into a lot of discussions with business owners around the different ways to pull money out of their corporation. And one of the things that's being done quite frequently right now in the accounting community is this idea of a capital gains strip. And the terminology, there's a number of names for this capital gains strip, but essentially what they're doing is a reorganization of the company, and they're removing or extracting funds out of the corporation and paying tax at a capital gains tax rate, which roughly in Canada translates to about 24 to 26%, depending on the province that you're in. So that seems to be much more appealing than taking dividend income from the business. So we see a lot of this activity happening right now. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that when I talk about freezes. But there's some really good planning that can be done around the extraction of funds from a corporation and using life insurance in that process. So as many of you know, we can tax shelter money inside a corporation, inside an insurance policy. We have the overfunding capabilities of life insurance that we can hold inside that corporation. And then when we get to retirement stage, if I want to access that money, I can leverage against that asset. And that would be different names for it in the marketplace, but corporate insured retirement program would be an example of one of the names that's used in the marketplace. And essentially what I'm doing is I'm taking a line of credit personally to use as income, and I'm leveraging that line of credit against my insurance policy that's inside my corporation. And if I'm going to do that, there's some little rules that we need to make sure of that we're satisfying. We want to make sure that we've got a guarantee fee discussion going on. We want to make sure that the accountants are involved in that discussion so that everybody's accounting for things properly. So there's some planning to do around it, but it is a very viable option in Canada to extract money from the corporation using a leveraged facility. And that leveraged facility is, of course, tax exempt, right? Because we're borrowing money, we're not actually taking the money out of the company. So when we look at that, we do have to look at what the interest rates are doing in the marketplace and understand what what's going to be paid in interest costs on an annual basis. But oftentimes that's significantly less than what we would be paying as dividends. But we do have to look at the long-term effect of it and how that all works out. So again, some good discussion and good planning, and we go on to our next topic. Business succession planning. This is an area where I spend a considerable amount of time with family businesses and family operations. We see a lot of businesses in Canada that are struggling with this conversation around, do I sell the business or do I keep it in the family? And I can't answer the question for anybody. We can just ask enough questions so that the owner of that business or the people that might be succeeding that business have the answers that they need to make informed decisions. And so one of the questions that I like to ask is it a viable business for multiple incomes or multiple families to live off of? If you think about how a lot of businesses are structured, they get started by the patriarch or the matriarch of the family, and we build that business up, and during the life of that business, it has supported a single family. And once the kids are old enough to start taking over shares or taking over some ownership of that business or planning to succeed that business, we need to start to consider, can this business support financially? Can it support multiple families? And some businesses can, and some businesses can't. So Again, we get into this conversation because a lot of people's wills will stipulate that my business transfers or my assets transfer to my spouse, and if my spouse predeceases me, then they transfers in equal shares to my children. That's the most common will that we see in the marketplace, and most family businesses don't have any other agreements in place. There's no shareholder agreements typically in family businesses and things. So if we're working with somebody, we need to understand what their will says as it relates to the shares in the business. Because if I've got one child that's coming into the business and I have multiple children that are not in the business, but my will says that I leave it in equal shares to all of my children, I've now put the child that's running the business in a position where he's supporting multiple families from his work. And that's through the structure. The most common structure of shares distribution is that there's only one class of shares. And so when I pay a dividend to myself, I have to pay a dividend to all my other shareholders as well. So there's lots of good planning that we can do around that, and restructures and freezes and things. And I'm going to talk again, as I said, about freezes coming up. One of the things we also want to know is who maintains control of the business. So if I'm running a business and I bring my son into the business or my daughter into the business, I want to know when is the right time or when is the wrong time for me to give up control. And a lot of people that build businesses never want to give up control of their business. And we see this in the financial industry. We see this with transitions between advisors, blocks of business, where we try and bring in a junior partner, but that senior advisor that's been in place for many years has difficulty giving up control of the business. And so they oftentimes stay on, maybe sometimes for good reasons and sometimes not the best reasons. So we always want to make sure that we understand those parameters when we're working with a business owner, is who maintains control of the shares of the company, the decisions of the company, the day-to-day operational activities. And what I see very often is the owner of the company will retain control until they feel that the children or the successors are in a position where they can manage the day-to-day operations. And one of the easy ways that I help a business owner is to suggest to them, take a month off. Don't go into the office, and give the control to the kids for a month and see what happens during that month. Now, some people say, oh, that's too long. So I say, okay, we'll try 2 weeks, because many people don't take that time away from their business and leave it to somebody else to run. So do it in small increments and see what the impact is. See how the staff reacts. See how the clients react of the business. See how the suppliers react. All of the different aspects of the different businesses that are out there, and that can help the business owner make a good plan on how to move forward. And so we get into these conversations around who's making operational decisions, how soon does that transfer over? Now you think about this and you think, well, how does this have anything to do with insurance? And so what I want to do is make you understand that when we're having these conversations, we're building up new key people in the organization. So we immediately are building a reliance of value on these people that are building operational value to the company. So we want to make sure that we, one, insure those people, but two, we also want to have discussions when we're talking about business and succession around what happens if we're in transition process and something happens to one of the key people. So it's either the person that's been operating the company or the person that's taking over the company. If we put all this time, effort, and energy into this transition plan, we want to make sure that we can somehow monetize all of our effort if something happens to one of those individuals. So it becomes very easy to have a discussion around life insurance in that situation. Okay. So we also want to understand what are the triggering events for a change of ownership or control. So as I said just now, we're trying to understand who the players are and how they're going to integrate, but also the financial impact of one of those people, having a heart attack, having a stroke, being diagnosed with cancer, or worse, they have an accident and they pass away. So there's all of these kinds of things that we want to talk about and we talk about the triggering events and how do we document these things. So again, as I said, oftentimes what we don't see in many family businesses is any type of shareholders agreement or buy-sell agreement. So we're relying really on the terms of the will. So we really need to understand how and when things transfer. But we also need to look at documentation around powers of attorney. So if we have somebody that becomes incapacitated that's running a business, what planning has been put in place if that person becomes incapacitated? So again, these are not things that many business owners think about, and it adds a tremendous amount of value, and it allows the client to have a high level of trust with their advisors when they're having these discussions with a business owner. So
Brad, we do
Yep.
have a question.
Sure, fire away.
How does the retirement strategy involving leveraging of whole life policy works if the business is being sold once the key person retired? What are the
Okay.
tax implications of such an event?
Okay, so this is where we get into the initial planning for putting insurance policies in place. If we have a business where we have an operating company that can be sold, or will likely be sold, we typically want to set up our insurance policy at the holdco level, not at the opco level. And the advantage of doing that, of course, is that when we have that transition of the sale of the business, the money comes down to or up to the holdco, and now I have funds in the holdco structure, and the insurance policy would be in the holdco structure. Having that structure in place is the least complicated way of doing this, because if I did a retirement strategy where I had an insurance policy in an operating company and then sold the operating company, I would have to figure out how I'm going to transition that policy out of the operating company prior to the sale. And that's going to create a disposition of the policy, and it's going to create some other issues. So we would typically see that happen prior to a retirement, that we set up that structure properly. So maybe not answering the exact question, because the structure that you outlined there is not a structure that we would typically see in place once we've put an insured leverage policy in place. We're typically going to have a holding company structure for that transaction. Okay. So moving forward, just talking about the impact on retirement. This question of, is the owner really retired? When we get into business succession and continuation discussions, we can get into some very intense conversations about retirement and what retirement means, because retirement to the person that started the company may mean I'm going to work 40 hours a week instead of 70. Retirement to the incoming junior son that is taking over the business, or daughter that's taking over the business, they may be thinking retirement means that you're no longer coming to the office. And so what does that mean? And how does succession tie into that retirement? And what I like to do is talk to clients about having a very distinctive plan where there's benchmarks along the way. And one of the ways to do that is to get into conversations around what training is required in order for next generation to be ready to take over full time, and defining some of those things and putting timelines around them and benchmarks to say, we've gotten to this point, okay, we're going to release X number of shares, or we're going to give this much control, or something along those lines. Again, it's always dependent on the individual company and the individual owners that are involved, but good planning on this goes a tremendous way to helping clients really set up for success, both in their retirement, and then for the continuation of the business. Okay. So I said I was going to talk about freezes, and I'm going to give a general overview of a freeze just as a ground set here. When we talk about freezes, what we're doing is we're saying that the company has grown from nothing to X level. And that X level, let's call it $4 million for easy numbers. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to exchange my common shares that I own, and I'm going to exchange them for preferred shares. And those preferred shares are non-growth shares, which simply means that moving forward, I know that my value that's attached to my ownership of the corporation is $4 million. What I do from there is then I restructure my new common shares. So I could have common shares. I could take back some of the common shares as the owner. I may take some of them, not all of them. It would defeat the purpose for me to have all of them, because then all the growth is in my hands again. But one of the things that I could do is I could say, I'm going to take back 10% of the shares, and then 90% of the shares on the common shares are going to go to a family trust. And the family trust is going to have beneficiaries that are all of my children, because I haven't decided which of my children are going to take over at this point in time. So that's one option that we see with freezes. And when we see that, what it does for us is it gives us some planning opportunities. The first planning opportunity is when I've frozen the shares in my company, I know what the tax liability is, as long as the tax rates stay the same. So as I said before, if we were talking about capital gains tax, I have the gain from my ACB up to my fair market value, which in the case that I've just described would be $4 million. And so I have tax on that $4 million, roughly 25%. So it's about $1 million in tax that I'm paying. And so where does that tax come from? Where does the funding for that come from? So when I have a conversation with somebody, I can pinpoint that number a little bit more clearly once a freeze has been done. The other thing that the freeze does for me is it gives me some planning opportunities around, how do I want to pay that tax? Do I want to use insurance to pay the tax? Do I want to set aside money personally to pay the tax within my estate? Do I want to leave money in my corporation to pay the tax? And what we need to do as planners is help the client understand what the most cost-effective way to pay that tax is, and that's always life insurance. Okay, as long as we have an insurable a client, we're going to have less expensive to use insurance than it is to pay the tax any other way. And the simple math for that is, if my problem is $1 million, if I need to extract $1 million out of my corporation because that's where I'm holding my money, I'm going to pay a dividend or maybe a capital gain type transaction on my death. But I still am paying tax to get access to that $1 million. So I'm paying more than $1 million to pay my $1 million net tax bill. If I use a life insurance policy, I've paid less than $1 million to have $1 million of life insurance. That's the easy conversation. Now, there's more in-depth things that we get into, of course, around the nuances of the tax. But in a general conversation, it's easy to say, if I have $1 million tax bill, do you want to pay more than $1 million or less than $1 million to pay the tax? And every client that I say that to says, definitely less. So how do we do that? Okay. So, but coming back to freezes, we've understood that we've got this frozen share value. So when is the right time to do a freeze? I get this question quite a bit from clients. I'm actually having a meeting this afternoon with a client to talk about this topic specifically. They're in a position where the company's growing quite a bit, and they're looking at, do they freeze now or do they wait? The question is never 100% do it today because it's the best time. It's always a judgment call for the client, because the things that tie into the freeze are you going to continue to operate as the majority shareholder, or are you giving up control of the company when you give common shares to someone else? So that becomes the big question, is who is going to take the common shares moving forward? Is it a trust? Is it a family trust? Is it an individual? Is it multiple individuals? And how is that all going to work? And are you going to take any common shares back as the owner that took the preferred shares? Your value is there as a preferred shareholder up to that point in time, but are you going to continue to participate in growth value, or are you just going to take revenue from the company on an ongoing basis? What does that all look like? Now, I've mentioned trusts a few times, and one of the questions is, should a trust be involved in the transaction when I do a freeze? And the answer is maybe. And it's not a guaranteed answer. It depends on how many children I have, how many people might be involved in the business moving forward, what kinds of transactions are happening inside my corporation at the time that I do the freeze. Can I make use of the capital gains exemption? Can I multiply the capital gains exemption? So all of these factors come into whether I use a trust or whether I give shares directly to individuals. And so there's no direct answer here. But what I do want to understand is, what are the rules of the trust, and who's setting the rules, and what are we going to do within the framework of the trust? Okay, and so we'll slide right into that conversation. And
before you go there,
yeah,
someone did ask, are the common shares in the holdco?
Yeah, so if you think about a structure, every business, you'll have common shares and preferred shares. You can have multiple classes of common shares. You could have A, B, C, D, all the way through Z. You can have preferred shares, and they can have similar types of categorizations. And in those categorizations, you can have common voting and common non-voting, and the same on the preferred side. You can have preferred voting and preferred non-voting. So the next question, or the question that was asked, is, are the common shares in the holdco? Well, yes, they are in the holdco, but they're also in the operating company. So it's about who's going to control those shares, and so who has the majority of those shares, and what voting rights do those shares carry? Okay, so that's a whole different discussion. That's probably an hour-long conversation, maybe, with a business owner around that structure. But if you have further questions on that, reach out to one of the tax and estate planning team, and we'd be happy to have a more in-depth conversation around, should they be common shares? Should they be voting common shares, non-voting common shares? What does it mean, the different classes and the like? Okay. So from a trust perspective, the first question is, do I need one? And the answer is no, you don't need one. The question then becomes, is, what does it do for me, and should I have one? And can I achieve what my desired results are without a trust? So to answer these questions, I really have to understand with the business owner, what is it that you're trying to accomplish? And are we trying to magnify the use of the capital gains exemption? So am I doing a transaction where I'm utilizing my children's capital gains exemption? I'm going to use a trust in that situation, for sure, because what I'm going to do is exchange shares into the trust, do the freeze and exchange my common shares for my preferred shares, and then I'm going to roll my new common shares into a trust, and I'm going to have multiple beneficiaries of that trust, where I can use their capital gains exemption against the growth and value of the company. So that can play very favorably for a family. The other side of using trusts is to buy time to make decisions, and that really is, when we look at a trust, we have to understand that there's a 21-year deemed disposition rule for trusts that says that if I establish my trust today, I have 21 years to make decisions around the distribution of the assets of that trust. If I don't make any distributions from the assets of those trusts, they will be taxed as if I deemed to have sold them. Okay, so we want to make sure that we have decisions before the end of 21 years. So that's what goes into the trust conversation, and we have to look at it and decide, what are we trying to accomplish first, and then the desired results without using the trust. Again, if we come back to a situation where we're really just trying to spread out the capital gains, we have to look and see how that affects or how that impacts the people that we're using the capital gains exemption for. And one of the conversations that I've had recently with a client was, do you want to use your child's capital gains exemption if they're going to potentially need to use it in the future? And are you passing the value of the savings on to them? And when we started to have that conversation, they decided not to use their kids' capital gains exemption because their children have another business that they're running already. So, and they thought if they use up their capital gains exemption on their sale, then they don't have that value to use for their own purposes later on. Again, it's just a conversation, and each individual situation is going to be very unique, and we need to take it with that light, is that each conversation is unique, and we want to make a plan that works for each individual family. Okay. So the last thing that comes into a lot of conversations this year with high net worth clients is the charitable donation strategies. Lots of people asking me, should I be setting up a foundation? Should I be just donating to a charity or a group of charities? Should I be doing that while I'm alive? Should I be doing that after I pass? Should I be doing it in my will? There's lots of these types of questions. So a lot of these questions stem from this first question of, when do the kids get enough? I can't answer that question for somebody. They have to decide that for themselves, but it is a really good question to ask people. And where it comes from is, a lot of people will say to me, I'm not worried about the tax because the kids are going to get enough anyways. And when I hear that comment, oftentimes the client doesn't understand that they're saying that they're going to pay the maximum amount of tax on their estate. They don't want to deal with anything. And their kids are going to get enough. So when I hear that conversation, what I like to do is introduce the topic of charitable donations and say, if the kids are going to get enough, in your opinion, after tax, would you rather have a charity that is either close to you or close to your community or in your community, or something that's related to you or you can relate to? Would you rather have the money that is going to go to tax go to a charity? Because if you believe the kids are going to get enough from the after tax value already, then what you're saying is that the amount that's going to tax, you don't mind parting with that. And when we start that conversation around, if you don't mind parting with it, would you give some of it or all of that to a charity? There's an opening for a discussion there around charitable gifting strategies. And that's all we're trying to do at this point, is open the conversation. And once we've opened the conversation, now it becomes, how do charities, or should charities, fit into my planning? And there's a lot of different planning strategies that we can use around charitable giving. I'm not going to get into those strategies today, but I do want to say that clients are getting more and more charitable, more philanthropic. And I think a lot of it has to do with all of the things that are happening in our world today, where clients are looking around and seeing people in need, and so they're looking for places to help. And a lot of times business owners don't realize that they can do really good planning and reduce their overall tax bill and make it a benefit to charities, as well as their families benefiting at the same time. Okay. So again, good conversation is being had around that. I wanted to talk about a couple of cases that I've worked on this year, and really I want to talk about the cases just to give some illustration to the power of conversation and having good discussions with your business owner clients. So I'm going to talk about these two cases, and then we'll leave some time for some questions at the end here. So this is just the general parameters of this tech company that I started working with. I had 3 partners in the company. They own about 80% of the overall shares in the company. and they have it's an aggressively growing tech company. They're going to be around a long time, or they're going to get bought out, one or the other. But their P&C advisor that does their business insurance for them on their building had instigated a conversation with them around key person insurance, because they saw that these three guys were invaluable to this company and the growth and the trajectory of the company. So my initial conversation was really around key person, and they wanted to know how it worked and how much they could get in coverage. And at the initial conversation we started, we figured out pretty quickly that they could all apply for around $1.5 million each of key person insurance. And I started asking some questions into the conversation, and we started talking about the risk associated with a buyout, and could the company survive if they had to pay out one or more of the three key shareholders. And that led into the conversation of valuation of the company, at which point we realized that their 80% stake currently rested at about $180 million. So each one of those individuals was going to have to be paid out about $60 million if something happened to any one of them. So we went way beyond a key person of 1.5 million and translated that into a $60 million applications on three individuals. That wouldn't have happened if I would have just stuck to the conversation around key person. And the importance of asking some really basic fundamental questions. They didn't even understand what a buy sell was in place for. They thought key person was what they were talking about, and they kind of lumped key person and buy sell together. But when they initially contacted me, it was just about key person. So long story short is I want to talk about the underwriting on files this size. We're talking about $180 million of risk that an insurance company is being asked to take on. So we had some good news, and that's that the three stakeholders are 37, 39, and 41, and all in good health from what conversations I had with them initially. The bad news is that underwriting that looks too easy usually isn't, and that's what I experienced. So these cases were initially put into underwriting early this year, and I have just settled two of those files. I'm still working on the third one because we're still waiting for a doctor's APS. So we had a few hiccups along the way between APSs. One of them is an occasional smoker, and the CEO of the company is doing a fair bit of international travel. So we got some initial feedback from the insurance carriers saying that we had between the carrier and the reinsurance companies, they were coming in for valuation. They didn't agree with our full 180 million valuation, but they did agree to look at somewhere around 150 million, which put us at a $50 million valuation. Some of the companies were at 75 million though for the share value. So that's quite a difference when you're talking to clients that are building a significant value company. But it was a good conversation to have with them, and we ended up with 50 million for each of these individuals, and we have some conditions though. So from an underwriting perspective, it's good to know how some of this stuff works when you get into these large cases. The first thing was a decision around if they want to take just 25 million, we had no conditions on future pricing or conversion options. But if they wanted to go to 50 million, we would have some conditions on repricing on conversion options, and some reinsurance extras were going to be applied. So when we started to look at it from a client's perspective, it was very simple for the client. They wanted as much as they could get, and they went for the 50 million. And we're going to get that last case through underwriting here shortly, by the sounds of it. We finally have got the doctor to commit to submitting the APS that's been under request for about 120 days. So long story short is, when we get into these cases, what we want to do is we want to understand is there more behind what we're seeing on the surface? And sometimes you have to bring different questioning to get to that. And we don't just rely on what the client is initially looking for. I've often said to advisors, just make them a client first and then do the planning. But sometimes it's prudent to do a few questions up front to see how big the need is at the initial point when you're making them a client. Because if anything were to have happened to these individuals and they would have only been insured for 1.5 million, and they would have had to had a buyout on that company on their shares, that would have been a significant impact to the company and probably would have sunk the company financially, because that's a major hit to try and come up with 50 million on a growing company. So that was the tech company side of things. I'm going to talk about a family legacy business that I've been working with this year, and it's a family business.
Sorry, Brad. Just before you move on to the family legacy, a question just came in. What type of insurance did you place on the tech company?
Yeah, so we started with 10-year term. And the reason for that, like I said, I didn't get into all of the details of the case, but I'll give you a few more details. They anticipate they're going to do an IPO here in the next maybe 3 to 5 years. It might happen sooner than that. It might take a little longer than that. But if they do an IPO, then the initial amount of insurance really was in place just to get them to that point. And so they didn't want to over commit at this point while they're building the value of their company. But what we did do is we've structured it so that the insurance will flow in through their holdcos. And what we'll do is, if they do an IPO, the money for the shares that they own each individually will have significant value down to their holdcos. And at that point in time, we would likely be doing conversions. We don't know if we're going to do full 50 million conversions or not, but we at least have the ability to be able to do that. And we'll get there within the next few years, I would think. The clients, though, are prepared for that. And so in the discussions, we did put 10-year term in place, but we did have discussions with them about conversions and how that works and what it's for and everything else. So the clients are very well prepared and understand that there's a transition process once they have cash in hand that they want to allocate into the insurance structures. So that was where we started. When we look at family legacy planning, we had a family business entering the second generation, and we have a spouse that has no involvement in the business. This is very, very common. We have parents that will start a business and one spouse is involved day-to-day operational of the business 6 days, 7 days a week. And the other spouse is either running the household or is in a completely different, unrelated situation. In this case, in particular, the spouse is a nurse that has nothing to do with the company that's being operated, and it's a manufacturing type business. So it's a very different. It couldn't be more different than what the second spouse, the nurse, does on a day-to-day basis. So they do have a few children, though, and some of the operational responsibility has already started to move to one of the children, but no shares have transferred at this point in time. And they have one other child is working in the business, and they're trying to learn one of the divisions. This company is fairly significant and has several divisions, but they have no desire to run things. They don't see it as something that they want to take over. They see how much dad works. They don't want to ever be in that position. And so really things are being targeted at the other child, which is a daughter that's working on the finance side of the business. And so there is a desire for an easy transition. And I always couch with clients, there's very rarely an easy transition of a business in a family situation. But one of the things that that they've done is that they have wills in place, and the wills are standard wills that we see everywhere, right? The wills pass everything to my spouse and then to my children in equal shares if my spouse has predeceased me. And I just simply asked a couple of questions around, what do you think that would look like if you had a common disaster, you and your spouse passed away together, or your spouse passes away, predeceases you, or if you pass your business to your spouse, is she going to move from being a nurse into operational day-to-day activities in this business? And if not, what will actually likely happen? And so we started to ask these questions, and really what the play was is that the children are already old enough to take over the business. So they really want the kids to take over the business. Mom doesn't want to have any involvement in it at all. In fact, Mom said, if I just get a cash payout and I don't have to deal with anything in the business, that would be my happiest day, because I've seen very little of my spouse over the years, and I don't want to be consumed into the same thing that he's been consumed in. So we started to talk to all of these questions, right? So what happens if the spouse is running the company, is predeceases the uninvolved spouse before the kids are ready? So we did answer, the kids are somewhat ready, but they're not fully ready yet. So one of the things that we did is had a conversation around preparing the children to take over the business. And that preparation includes working with a consultant that prepares next generation staff. Okay. And it doesn't have to be children, but they're bringing staff that might be at level A and they need them at level B. What are the steps to get them to level B? What are the processes? What are the things they have to learn? Who do they have to get education from, or where do they have to get education from? So all of this was in the conversation and starting to happen. And the question around, do we know what the kids want? I talked to the children each individually. There is a third child in this situation that wants nothing to do with the business, has seen it only as a horrible thing for their family, simply because they never had a relationship with their father. Okay, so they really want nothing to do with the business. Although when I did ask the question, do you see that you would want some financial value from the business, that was a bit of a different answer. So we still have to understand what the children are saying and what they actually mean when they say, I don't want any involvement with the business, but I want some value from the business. Okay. So is there consistency in the direction of the family business? So the kids are thinking one direction, the parents might be thinking a different direction. How do we line those things up, and how do we go through that process? Are there any other stakeholders in the process? So in this situation, we've got a business manager that is integral to the operation. So dad's got a non-shareholder partner in the business that is very integral to the growth and success of this business, and gets along well enough with the son that's in the business, but not so great with the daughter that's in the business that would likely be the one taking over. So how do we deal with that? And are there other stakeholders that we're going to have those kinds of issues with? Okay. Then we get into questions like, does a freeze make sense? And if so, when does the freeze make sense? Do we do a transition plan now? When do we instigate that? When does dad want to actually pull back? Does he want to retire? Does he want to just shorten up his hours? Or is he going to work 70 hours a week until he's in the grave? And that's a reality for a lot of business owners. We do have that one business manager that is an employee that would really like to take some shares and some ownership of the succession of the business. So how do we integrate him into that practice? All of these things come with discussions around insurance and who we should be insuring, and what values that we need to set aside for retirement of dad, or paying out values to mom if she doesn't want to be involved, and how the shares are going to transfer. So there's lots of insurance planning in these discussions. This file is still in process and probably will be. I've been working on this one for a few months now, And we'll probably be another few months of kind of figuring out what it is exactly that the family wants to do. But once we understand that, then we'll be able to put some recommendations forward to them, and then they can move forward. And that's when we'll see some applications in this process. So just really quickly working the process. So what we try and do is make sure that you identify some high net worth clients that you want some support on. So don't try and say, I want you to talk to every client in my book of business. That's not going to be a good process. What you want to do is identify maybe 1 or 2 or 3 of your top clients that you think need some of this support and help with, or you need some support and help with to instigate these kind of discussions or have these kind of discussions with their families. So then you engage with us in a conversation about the file, and we're going to determine together whether we're just helping you on a product sale, or are we doing a full planning trail and working together, and how we're going to work together. We'll set that all up together, and if we're many times when we're involved in these files, it becomes a split case when you're working with us. But if it's just general help on the file, then there's no split on the case, and we can just give you some general information and help you along your way. And I develop a report for the client, and a report can look different from all of the tax and estate planning people. Some of us do PowerPoint, some of us do full Word documents. It all depends on the client and the necessity in the situation. So what we want to do is make sure that your client is getting something that they can review, and bring that client relationship stronger for yourself, and make sure that there's some good sales happening on the back end. With that, I am going to open it up to some questions. If we have any questions from anybody out in the audience. Yeah, so splits are based on your relationship with the planner that's involved, right? So my typical works on a graded scale. So I'm at 40% split to me, 60% split to you on the first 25,000 of FYC. On the next 25,000 of FYC, we're at a 30% split and to me, and 70% split to you. And then anything over 50,000 FYC in a year total is at 20% to me and 80% to you. So what you're really getting is quite a bit of support and help for very low cost to you. And if you think about the example of the case that I illustrated with the tech company, the advisor asked me to come in and help them with a file where we would have been doing splits on a $1.5 million case for times 3 individuals. And we ended up with a $50 million case on those 3 individuals. My initial split would have been at 40%, but it quickly went to 20%, and it's 20% of a much bigger number, or in your case, 80% of a much bigger number. So that's how the splits work. And so very easy to find me. It's bhyde at idcwin.ca. And if you don't remember that, if you know who your BDE is, depending on where you work in the country, I'm not going to list all the BDEs, the business development executives, but if you're working with IDC and you have a contact person, they'll know how to get a hold of the tax and estate planning team. So feel free. Happy to help.
I'll put in a plug for IDC WIN Big as well. You can always come to live chat, and we'd be able to assist you as well.
Yeah, very good. Thanks, Lisa.
Okay, some extension of the client aged 40. He is married, his wife is age 40, and they are looking at a joint last to die and has 2 young children.
Okay. So what I would suggest is that that individual gives a call to either myself or one of the other tax and estate planning people and have a conversation, because there's a whole bunch of questions that I would have to ask, and we'll be here for the next half hour, 40 minutes if I'm doing it here. So feel free to reach out on that question, and we'll get into some specific conversation. Dealing in Atlantic Canada is that Chris? Is Chris, yeah. And Chris and or Frank. So Yeah, feel free again to reach out to your BDE and find out who your contact person is on the tax and estate planning side of things, and just make sure that you're asking for somebody in your region. It's very hard for us to work right across the country.
Questions?
All right. Well, everybody, whoever was on the line today, thank you for your time. And it's always interesting doing these sessions when you have nobody in front of you and I'm just looking at myself, but we got through it, and hopefully everybody got some value out of today, and hopefully you'll think about your high net worth clients and reach out to one of the tax and estate planning team members. Thanks again, everybody.
Thanks.